For 40 years, mastering the crashbox transmission was the sacred skill that separated real truck drivers from amateurs. The grinding gears, the double clutching, the split-second timing, this was what made you a professional behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. Then in 1967, Mack Trucks built an engine that would quietly destroy this entire culture. The Maxidyne didn't just change trucking, it made the crashbox irrelevant, and drivers hated it for that. This is the story of how truckers fought the engine that made their skills obsolete and lost. In the golden age of trucking, before computers and automatic transmissions, driving a big rig required a level of mechanical sympathy that bordered on artistry. The crashbox transmission, so named because its gears were unsynchronized, demanded that drivers master the delicate dance of double clutching, rev matching, and gear floating that kept massive trucks moving down America's highways. This wasn't simply a matter of pushing a clutch pedal and moving a gear lever. Professional drivers had to understand the precise relationship between engine speed, road speed, and gear ratios, coordinating their left foot, right foot, and shifting hand in a complex choreography that took years to perfect. Many engines of the era, including Detroit's two-stroke diesels and the big Cummins and Caterpillar engines, still required drivers to keep the engine carefully within its power band. A typical diesel engine of the 1950s and early 60s might develop its peak horsepower at 2100 RPM and its maximum torque at 1400 RPM, but the usable power band was relatively narrow, often only a few hundred RPM wide. Drop below this range and the engine would bog down and lose power. Exceed it and you'd be wasting fuel while the engine screamed without producing additional work. The solution was the crashbox transmission, typically featuring 10, 13, or even 18 forward gears. These transmissions allowed drivers to keep the engine spinning in its narrow power band regardless of road conditions. A skilled driver could work through the gears with mechanical precision, double clutching on every shift to match engine speed with transmission speed, floating gears when the timing was perfect, and using techniques like split shifting to access even more gear ratios when needed. The most complex trucks featured twin-stick transmissions, where drivers operated both a main gearbox and an auxiliary transmission simultaneously. These systems could provide 20 or more forward gear combinations, giving drivers the flexibility to find exactly the right ratio for any situation. Operating a twin-stick required drivers to think several moves ahead, planning their shifting strategy like a chess master, because the wrong combination could leave the truck stuck between gears with no power to the wheels. The actual process of shifting demanded complete attention to the engine's voice. Experienced drivers learned to read the subtle changes in diesel tone that signaled the perfect moment to shift, listening for the slight drop in pitch that indicated the engine was beginning to fall out of its power band. They developed an almost musical sense of timing, knowing exactly when to lift their foot from the throttle, depress the clutch, and move the gear lever to the next position. The art lay in matching engine RPM to transmission speed during the shift. Too fast and the gears would clash violently. Too slow and the engine would bog down before the next gear engaged. Master drivers could float gears without using the clutch at all, timing their shifts so perfectly that the transmission slipped smoothly from one gear to the next without grinding. This technique required reading the engine's behavior so precisely that the driver could predict exactly when the gear teeth would align, slipping the transmission into the next ratio at the precise moment when no force was being transmitted through the drivetrain. Miss that timing by even a fraction of a second, and the result was the grinding, crunching sound that marked an amateur. Each shift had to be executed flawlessly because any hesitation or missed gear could cause the truck to lose precious speed. A driver who missed a downshift on a steep grade might find his truck slowing from 45 to 25 miles per hour in seconds, forcing him to downshift again under load, a difficult maneuver that often resulted in grinding gears and lost momentum. The worst-case scenario was dropping so far out of the power band that the truck would crawl up the hill at walking speed, holding up traffic and burning excessive fuel. This complexity created a natural hierarchy on America's highways. Truck stops and loading docks became informal classrooms where veteran drivers shared the secrets of their trade. A driver who could smoothly shift a 13-speed Fuller while maintaining speed on a steep grade earned the respect of his peers, Conversely, a driver who ground gears or missed shifts was marked as inexperienced or careless. The crashbox transmission had become the defining element of trucking professionalism, the skill that separated those who truly understood their machines from those who were simply along for the ride. By the mid-60s, Mack Trucks found itself in an increasingly difficult competitive position. While companies like Detroit Diesel, Cummins, and Caterpillar were locked in a horsepower war, building engines that produced more and more peak power at higher and higher RPM, Mack's engineers began questioning whether this approach actually served truck operators effectively. The prevailing wisdom demanded engines that could spin to 2400 RPM or higher to generate competitive horsepower numbers, but Mack's engineering team noticed that real-world trucking rarely required sustained high RPM operation. Instead of joining the horsepower race, Mack's engineers pursued a radically different philosophy that would threaten the very foundation of crashbox culture. Mack's engineering team, led by figures such as Carroll H. Bud Jeffries and engineer Jack Curcio, began developing an engine that would produce massive torque at low RPM, creating a wide, flat power band that would fundamentally change how trucks operated. This wasn't simply a matter of building a bigger engine or adding more cylinders. It required rethinking the entire relationship between engine design and transmission requirements. If the engine worked as intended, the crashbox would become unnecessary. The result was the Maxidyne engine, built around Mack's ENDT 675 inline-six diesel, producing roughly 237 horsepower with a broad power curve that remained strong across a wide RPM range. While competitors were building engines that made their peak power at 2100 RPM or higher, the Maxidyne maintained substantial pulling power even as RPM dropped toward 1200 and sometimes below. Where conventional diesels might lose significant torque as engine speed dropped below their peak, the Maxidyne maintained strong torque output across an unusually wide operating range. The fundamental difference lay in how the engine responded to load changes. Most diesel engines of the era produced their strongest pulling power in a relatively narrow RPM range and lost torque as engine speed dropped. When a conventional diesel encountered increased resistance, whether from a steep grade, a headwind, or a heavy load, the engine would begin to slow down and lose torque simultaneously. This created a cascading effect where the engine produced less power precisely when more power was needed, forcing the driver to downshift immediately to bring the engine back into its narrow power band. The Maxidyne reversed this relationship through what engineers called torque rise, the engine's ability to produce more pulling power as RPM decreased under load. When the Maxidyne encountered resistance and began to slow down, the engine's torque output actually increased, allowing it to fight back against the load rather than surrendering to it. This meant that instead of requiring an immediate downshift when engine speed dropped, the Maxidyne could absorb the load change and continue pulling effectively at the lower RPM. This characteristic allowed the engine to lug without stalling, a behavior that would have killed a conventional diesel, but actually represented the Maxidyne's most efficient operating mode. Where other engines demanded constant shifting to stay within their narrow power bands, the Maxidyne could adjust to changing conditions by varying its own output, essentially functioning as both engine and transmission. The engine absorbed load changes that would have required gear changes in conventional trucks, maintaining forward momentum without the power interruptions that came with shifting. The implications of this design philosophy became clear when Mack paired the Maxidyne with its new 5-speed Maxitorque transmission, a heavy-duty gearbox with extremely wide gear spacing and a deep low gear designed specifically to exploit the Maxidyne's broad torque range. This wasn't a cost-cutting measure or a compromise. It was a deliberate engineering decision based on the engine's operating characteristics that would render decades of shifting expertise obsolete. Because the Maxidyne maintained strong torque as RPM dropped, Mack could space its gears much wider, allowing a 5-speed transmission to perform comparably to a 10-speed in most highway conditions. A conventional diesel engine might need to be shifted from 4th to 3rd gear as soon as engine speed dropped 200 RPM to maintain power output. The Maxidyne could continue pulling effectively even as engine speed fell 300 or 400 RPM below its peak torque, eliminating the need for frequent gear changes. This created a revolutionary possibility, a heavy-duty truck that could operate effectively with far fewer gear changes than anyone had thought possible. The Maxidyne could pull a loaded trailer up a long grade in a single gear, maintaining momentum and speed without the constant shifting that characterized conventional trucks. Mack's marketing emphasized that the Maxidyne reduced the need for constant shifting, highlighting how the wide torque band reduced the transmission's workload. But for drivers who had spent their careers mastering complex shifting patterns, the idea of a 5-speed transmission in a heavy-duty truck seemed almost insulting. When the first Maxidyne-powered trucks reached the hands of professional drivers, the reaction was immediate and largely negative. Drivers who had spent decades perfecting their shifting technique found themselves confronted with an engine that seemed to violate every principle they had learned about diesel operation. The Maxidyne's ability to pull strongly at low RPM directly contradicted the fundamental rule that had governed trucking since the beginning: keep the engine in its power band at all costs. When they heard the engine speed begin to drop under load, their instinct was to downshift immediately to bring the RPM back up to what they considered the proper operating range. This behavior, which had been essential for success with narrowband engines, actually hurt the Maxidyne's performance by taking it out of its optimal torque range. The cultural resistance went deeper than simple mechanical misunderstanding. Veterans complained that Mack was dumbing down trucking, making it accessible to drivers who hadn't paid their dues learning proper shifting technique. At truck stops, drivers mocked the 5-speed transmission, joking that Mack had built a pickup truck engine for 18-wheelers. Some drivers complained that the Maxidyne drove like a farm tractor, criticizing its willingness to lug down at low RPM instead of demanding the constant attention that they associated with professional trucking. Others joked that the truck drives itself, suggesting that the simplified operation removed the skill from driving. Many drivers believed that Mack had simply cheapened the transmission to save money, assuming that fewer gears meant inferior performance. Drivers worried that the simplified transmission would struggle on steep grades where they were accustomed to using 8, 10, or even more gear changes to maintain speed. The idea that a truck could climb mountains without constant shifting seemed to violate the fundamental laws of physics as they understood them. The resistance was so strong that Mack found itself in the unusual position of having to retrain drivers to operate their own trucks effectively. The company's field representatives spent countless hours teaching drivers to trust the engine's low RPM pulling ability, encouraging them to let the engine lug down to 12 or 1300 RPM before shifting. This went against every instinct that drivers had developed over years of operating conventional engines. Many drivers simply refused to adapt, continuing to shift the Maxidyne as if it were a conventional high RPM engine. They would downshift at 1600 RPM, taking the engine out of its most efficient operating range and negating many of the benefits that the wide torque band provided. Some drivers even requested that their trucks be equipped with conventional engines and transmissions, preferring familiar technology over the new system's advantages. The cultural conflict was particularly intense among owner-operators who took personal pride in their driving skills and viewed their trucks as extensions of their professional identity. These drivers had often invested years in learning to operate complex transmissions efficiently, and the Maxidyne seemed to make that expertise irrelevant. The idea that a 5-speed transmission could outperform their carefully honed 13-speed technique challenged their understanding of what made a good truck driver. Despite the initial resistance from drivers, the Maxidyne's practical advantages became impossible to ignore as more trucks entered service. Fleet operators began noticing results even while drivers continued to complain about the simplified transmission. The engine's wide torque band delivered benefits that extended far beyond simplified shifting, fundamentally changing how heavy trucks performed in real-world conditions. The performance advantages were most apparent on long grades, where the difference became visually dramatic. A typical truck equipped with a narrowband engine might need to downshift 3 or 4 times while climbing a mountain pass, losing momentum with each gear change and struggling to maintain highway speeds. Meanwhile, a Maxidyne-equipped truck could often climb the same grade in a single gear, maintaining steady speed and momentum without the power interruptions that came with frequent shifting. Other drivers would watch in amazement as the Mack truck pulled steadily past them while they worked frantically through their gears, losing speed with every shift. Fleet operators began reporting modest fuel economy improvements, typically around 5 to 10%, compared to conventional engine and transmission combinations, savings that translated directly to improved profitability. The simplified transmission also reduced maintenance costs and improved reliability, as crashbox transmissions wore out faster under constant shifting. Training new drivers became dramatically easier, with operators able to have drivers operating Maxidyne trucks effectively after just a few days of instruction rather than weeks of complex gear training. The training advantages proved especially valuable as the trucking industry expanded rapidly in the late 60s and early 70s. Fleet operators discovered that they could train new drivers on Maxidyne trucks in a fraction of the time required for conventional equipment. Instead of spending weeks teaching complex double-clutching techniques and gear-floating skills, instructors could focus on basic safety and load handling procedures. This dramatically reduced training costs and allowed fleets to expand their driver pools more quickly to meet growing freight demand. As word of these advantages spread through the trucking industry, other manufacturers began developing their own wide-torque band engines. Caterpillar later introduced engines like the 3406 with stronger low RPM torque, while Cummins developed the big cam engines that offered broader power bands than their predecessors. Detroit Diesel eventually moved toward broader torque curves as well, culminating decades later in engines like the Series 60. The transmission manufacturers responded by developing new gearboxes optimized for wide torque band engines. Fuller introduced transmissions with wider gear spacing, recognizing that engines like the Maxidyne no longer required the closely spaced ratios that had been necessary for narrow-band diesels. Allison developed automatic transmissions specifically designed to take advantage of high torque, low RPM engine characteristics. By the late 70s and into the 80s, other engine builders increasingly began adopting the wide torque band philosophy that Mack had pioneered with the Maxidyne. New trucks increasingly featured engines designed to produce strong torque at low RPM, paired with transmissions that had fewer gears but wider spacing between ratios. Although unsynchronized crashbox transmissions remained common for decades, their dominance began to fade as wide-torque band engines and improved transmission designs gained ground. The change wasn't just technological, it was cultural. A new generation of drivers entered the industry without ever learning the complex shifting techniques that had been essential for earlier generations. These drivers operated trucks that were more fuel efficient, more reliable, and easier to drive than their predecessors, but they lacked the mechanical skills that had once defined trucking professionalism.